The history books you read in school were curated with great precision, choosing exactly what you should remember and, more importantly, what you should forget. Perhaps you have heard of the American Revolution or the Civil War, but have you ever heard the name Charles Deslondes? If you are drawn to the hidden layers of the American experience, please consider subscribing to the Ink of History, where we peel back the veneer of the past to reveal the truths that were never meant to be taught. Imagine a cold, damp night in January of 1811, just 30 miles upriver from the bustling, vibrant streets of New Orleans. The air is thick with the smell of sugarcane and the impending silence of a winter storm. Deep within the shadows of the plantation belt, a secret is moving. It is not the quiet shuffle of laborers, but the synchronized rhythm of an army. You have been told that enslaved people in the United States were largely passive, waiting for a savior or a legislative act to grant them their dignity. That is a lie. What happened along the German coast in 1811 was not a riot. It was the largest, most sophisticated, and most heavily armed insurrection of enslaved people in the history of the American territories. Why was this event systematically scrubbed from our national consciousness? Why does this story rarely surface in the hallowed halls of academia or the chapters of high school textbooks? The answer lies in the terror it instilled in the hearts of the slaveholding class, a fear so profound that they went to extraordinary lengths to ensure the suppression of the narrative. To understand the magnitude of this event, we must look at the landscape of the Louisiana Territory in the early 19th century. It was a volatile frontier, a place where the Haitian Revolution had sent shockwaves through the Caribbean and the Gulf Coast. The enslaved people on these plantations were not merely laborers, they were veterans of conflict, many having memories of war and strategies of resistance. Charles Deslondes, a man born in Saint-Domingue, arrived in Louisiana bringing with him the tactical genius forged in the fires of the Haitian struggle for independence. He understood that the power of the plantation owners was an illusion maintained by the threat of violence. If that threat could be neutralized, if the perceived masters could be shown to be vulnerable, the entire structure of the American slave system could be forced to its knees. Over the course of the following narrative, we will dissect the anatomy of this insurrection. We will look at the weapons they forged, the military precision with which they marched, and the brutal reality of the reaction that followed. We will explore why the historians of the time chose to label this as a mere skirmish rather than the full-scale military offensive that it truly was. The German coast, named for the early European settlers who established farms there, had become a bastion of excessive wealth built on the back of brutal sugarcane cultivation. The work was exhausting, the discipline was near total, and the psychological weight of bondage was intended to be absolute. Yet, in the kitchens, the fields, and the moonlit barracks, a clandestine network was forming. Charles Deslondes was not acting alone. He was the center of a web that connected hundreds of people across multiple plantations. They communicated in whispers, using the rhythmic thud of the harvest as a cover for the exchange of information. They knew the terrain, they knew the patrol routes, and they knew exactly when the militia was at its weakest. As we move deeper into the events of January 8, 1811, keep in mind that this was not a desperate gamble. This was a calculated strike. The insurrectionists, numbering upwards of 500, were armed with cane knives, axes, and stolen firearms. They carried banners. They wore uniforms they had fashioned themselves. They marched with the rhythm of soldiers, led by Charles Deslondes, moving toward the ultimate goal of New Orleans itself. They believed, with a conviction that remains chilling to contemplate, that they could seize the city and declare a free territory. Consider the atmosphere of that night. The darkness was absolute. As they moved from the Andre plantation, they were not just men and women escaping, they were an army of liberation. They moved forward with a sense of purpose that defied everything the white population believed about their subjects. For the first time, the masters were the ones hiding, trembling in their homes as the sound of drums echoed across the river. The white authorities in New Orleans were caught completely off guard. The terror of the French and Spanish elite was palpable. They had spent years telling themselves that their system was stable, that their servants were content, and that the geography of the Mississippi River would prevent any organized resistance. That night, those delusions were shattered. The march of Charles Deslondes and his followers was an undeniable statement of human agency. They were claiming their right to exist outside the maws of servitude. They were rewriting the script of their own lives. The response from the government of the Louisiana Territory was swift and merciless. When a force is faced with a challenge to its very existence, it does not respond with justice. It responds with a totalizing, overwhelming violence. The militia was mobilized, augmented by federal troops, and they descended upon the insurrectionists with the singular goal of erasure. Not just the erasure of the movement, but the erasure of the memory. The battle that followed was not a contest of equals. It was a slaughter. Charles Deslondes and his men fought with a bravery that was remarked upon even by their enemies, but they were outgunned and eventually overwhelmed. The aftermath was a dark chapter of history that few are brave enough to confront. The leaders were captured, subjected to sham trials, and executed in a way meant to terrorize any who might dare to follow in their footsteps. Their heads were displayed on poles along the road to New Orleans, a grotesque warning that served as the final act of a campaign to ensure that the rebellion would be forgotten. But the memory lived on in the songs and the stories of the enslaved communities, passed down through generations, surviving in the margins of oral history. Why did the official record remain silent for so long? Because acknowledging the 1811 uprising would mean acknowledging that the slave system was not a benevolent institution or an inevitable reality, but a violent occupation that was constantly being fought. It would mean admitting that the American identity was forged in a struggle where the enslaved were active participants, not passive objects. To teach this in schools would force a radical reevaluation of the heroes of the era. The governors, the militiamen, and the plantation owners were not just pioneers of a new democracy. They were the defenders of a system that Charles Deslondes and his army fought to destroy. The historical record was curated to make the path toward emancipation seem like a gift handed down by the political elite, rather than a war that was fought on every acre of land. By omitting the 1811 uprising, the architects of history created a vacuum where the agency and the brilliance of the resistance were lost. They erased the faces of those who dared to dream of a different outcome. As we look back, we must ask ourselves, what else is hidden in the shadows? How many other movements, how many other leaders like Charles Deslondes have been buried by the weight of time and the convenience of official narratives? The story of the German coast is not an outlier. It is a lens through which we can see the entire struggle for Black freedom in America. It is a story of profound courage, of tactical sophistication, and of an enduring desire for self-determination that no amount of violence could truly extinguish. We are left to wonder about the lives that were spent in that struggle, the families they left behind, and the legacy they whispered to the wind. The silence that followed the 1811 uprising was not a sign of peace. It was the silence of a grave that the victors hoped no one would ever disturb. But stones can be turned over, and the voices that were once silenced can be heard again if we are willing to listen closely to the echoes. The memory of the insurrection is a haunting reminder that power, while durable, is always susceptible to the collective will of the oppressed. When we study history, we often look for the big names, the grand speeches, and the orderly transitions of power. But the true heartbeat of history is found in the moments where the status quo is challenged. The 1811 uprising remains one of the most important events in the story of this country because it forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality of resistance. It tells us that for as long as there has been a system of control, there has been a counter-movement of freedom. Charles Deslondes and his people were not failures because they were defeated in battle. They were pioneers who carved a path that others would eventually follow to victory. They proved that the system was not invulnerable and that the belief in liberty could burn even in the darkest of nights. As we conclude this investigation, it is important to reflect on what we have uncovered. We have seen how a single event can be erased from the national narrative through fear and silence. We have explored the strategic brilliance of a leader who dared to fight for his people, and we have witnessed the brutal response of a state that feared the truth of that struggle. The 1811 uprising is not just a forgotten story, it is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It serves as a bridge to understanding why we must continue to dig into the past, to question the stories we have been told, and to ensure that the voices of those who fought for justice are never truly silenced again. Memory is a form of resistance, And by remembering Charles Deslondes and the warriors of the German coast, we are participating in the ongoing act of historical reclamation. History is not a stagnant record of the past. It is a living, breathing dialogue that invites us to engage with the realities of those who came before us. The journey we have taken into the heart of the 1811 uprising has been a journey through the dark corridors of memory. We have seen how the act of forgetting can be a tool of power and how the act of remembering can be a tool of liberation. If you feel that this story has changed your perspective on the American past, please join us in our mission to bring these hidden histories to the light. There are so many more voices waiting to be heard, so many more battles that have been erased from the map of our awareness. Support the Ink of History by subscribing and sharing this content, and help us ensure that the truth is given the space it deserves. Every share, every view, and every conversation is a strike against the erasure of the past. Together we can build a more comprehensive, more honest understanding of our history, one story at a time. The echoes of the German coast are still with us, and they are reminding us that the fight for truth is the fight for ourselves. Thank you for walking this path with us. Stay curious, stay questioning, and never stop seeking the stories that lie beneath the surface of the world you think you know. The silence that followed the initial telling of this tale is not an absence of sound, but rather a heavy, pressurized space waiting to be filled with the weight of consequence. When we peel back the layers of the 1811 uprising, we are not merely excavating a military engagement or an act of insurrection. We are unearthing an entire philosophy of autonomy that was systematically buried under the soil of Louisiana. The German coast functioned as a crucible of extreme capital and extreme cruelty. It was a place where the logic of profit was inscribed onto the physical bodies of those enslaved, and where the resistance, embodied by Deslondes, represented a radical rejection of that logic. To understand this, we must look beyond the skirmishes and the hangings and recognize that what took place in January 1811 was a foundational challenge to the very architecture of American slavery. Consider the geography of the rebellion itself. The German coast was not a remote wilderness. It was the industrial heartland of the territory, a corridor of immense wealth that relied on the continuous, crushing labor of the enslaved. By choosing to march toward New Orleans, Deslondes and his ranks were not just fleeing, they were aiming for the seat of colonial power. They understood, perhaps better than the white planners who underestimated them, that the system was held together by the illusion of absolute control. When that illusion was shattered by the sound of drums and the clatter of pikes, the terror that gripped the white population was not merely a reaction to violence, it was a recognition of their own precariousness. The uprising forced the plantation class to confront the reality that their wealth was anchored in a powder keg. This brings us to the uncomfortable truth that history, as taught in conventional classrooms, tends to sanitize. We often hear the narrative of the revolution as a singular event defined by documents and declarations, but we omit the internal revolutions that occurred alongside it. The 1811 uprising was a declaration of independence in its own right, written not in ink on parchment, but in the collective movement of individuals claiming the rights of men in a land that deemed them property. While the Founding Fathers were busy debating the fine points of liberty, the men and women of the German coast were putting those concepts to the ultimate test. Their failure to overthrow the regime in the immediate term does not negate the legitimacy of their struggle. On the contrary, it highlights the immense, overwhelming force of a state apparatus that existed specifically to neutralize such claims. We must also interrogate the archive itself. Why does so little remain of their own voices? The record we possess is largely filtered through the lens of the victors. We read court transcripts, official reports, and panicked letters written by those who viewed the rebels as nothing more than agents of chaos. We have to learn to read between the lines, to listen for the ghostly presence of the insurgents in the very documents that sought to condemn them. Every time a witness testified to the organization of the march, they were unintentionally confirming the intelligence and the strategic foresight of the individuals they were characterizing as savages. By analyzing these records with a critical eye, we can begin to reconstruct the motivations behind the rebellion, the desire for a life free from the lash, the hunger for communal agency, and the profound, unshakable belief that justice was not a gift to be granted, but a reality to be seized. The ripple effects of this event were felt far beyond the boundaries of Louisiana. It set a precedent for fear, leading to the tightening of slave codes and the expansion of the militia systems that would eventually define the security infrastructure of the antebellum South. The state learned that it had to be prepared to deploy overwhelming violence at a moment's notice, and this lesson became institutionalized. Every time you see a history book that emphasizes the stability of the South before the Civil War, remember the 1811 uprising. Remember the smoke that rose from the sugar mills, and remember the determination of the men who stood their ground. That stability was a facade maintained through a permanent state of emergency that required the constant surveillance and suppression of the Black population. As we delve deeper, we encounter the complexity of alliance and betrayal. The region was a mosaic of cultures, and the dynamics of the uprising were influenced by these diverse backgrounds. Some of the enslaved had fought in the revolutions of Saint-Domingue, bringing with them a tactical knowledge that turned a local riot into a genuine military threat. This transnational influence is crucial. The American South did not exist in a vacuum. It was part of a larger Atlantic world where ideas of freedom and insurrection were circulating like wildfire. The 1811 uprising was not an isolated incident. It was a localized eruption of a global earthquake. When we view it through this lens, the event takes on a much larger significance. It becomes a chapter in the long, arduous struggle for human rights that spans across the Caribbean, Europe, and the Americas. There is a profound emotional resonance to this story that goes beyond mere historical inquiry. It is about the inherent human need for dignity. Imagine the moment of decision when a group of people looked at the conditions of their existence and chose to risk everything, not necessarily for a guarantee of success, but for the possibility of a different future. That act of defiance is the purest form of human agency. It is the moment when the object of someone else's profit becomes the subject of their own history. And because they chose to act, they left behind a legacy that continues to resonate. It is a reminder that even in the most restricted circumstances, the human spirit is capable of radical imagination. They imagined a world where they could stand tall, and they dared to walk toward it, even when the path was blocked by death. We must also consider the role of memory in our present-day society. We live in an era where the past is often treated as a weapon, used to justify current inequalities or to silence dissent. By recovering the story of the 1811 uprising, we are doing more than just filling in a gap in the record. We are actively dismantling the narrative of historical inevitability. We are showing that the world that exists today was not preordained, but was the result of countless choices, struggles, and repressions. There were alternatives to the path that was taken, and there were people who fought for those alternatives. By acknowledging their resistance, we gain a better understanding of the forces that shaped our present. We stop seeing history as a static backdrop and start seeing it as a dynamic field of possibilities. There is a quiet yet persistent urgency to this work. Many of the sites where these events occurred have been paved over or repurposed, their histories obscured by the relentless march of development. We might walk past a field or a highway today without ever knowing that it was the site of a profound struggle for liberty. This is a form of erasure that is just as dangerous as the physical violence that occurred centuries ago. If we do not mark these sites, if we do not teach these stories, we allow the significance of these events to fade into oblivion. We become complicit in the silencing of those who came before us. This is why the act of sharing these stories is so vital. It is a way of reclaiming the landscape, of turning the soil into a repository of memory. As you reflect on these revelations, consider your own position in this unfolding dialogue. We are all inheritors of this history, whether we acknowledge it or not. The structures of our society, the disparities we see in our communities, and the very way we talk about freedom are all shaped by the echoes of these long-ago battles. To engage with the 1811 uprising is to engage with the unfinished business of the American experiment. It is to recognize that the promises of equality and justice were not fully realized, and that the struggle to fulfill them remains an ongoing endeavor. The people of the German coast were the pioneers of this struggle, and their legacy is woven into the fabric of our collective consciousness. There is an inherent beauty in the tenacity of these people. They lived in a world that sought to deny their humanity at every turn, yet they maintained a depth of resilience that is truly humbling. Their bravery wasn't defined by the outcome of their final march, but by the fact that they dared to challenge a system that seemed invincible. They remind us that power is never absolute, and that resistance is always possible. This is the lesson we must carry forward. In our own times, when faced with systems that seem immovable and injustices that seem insurmountable, we should look to the example of 1811. We should remember that even in the darkest of circumstances, there are those who will rise, who will organize, and who will demand the right to define their own lives. The journey we have taken is, in many ways, just beginning. There is so much more to learn, so many more archives to open, and so many more voices to amplify. Our commitment to this exploration is a commitment to the truth, however difficult or uncomfortable it may be. We choose this path because we believe that a society that ignores its past is doomed to repeat its errors, but a society that confronts its history with honesty can begin to heal and grow. This is the promise of the ink of history, and it is a promise we invite you to keep with us. As we continue to dig, to write, and to share, we are building a bridge between the ghosts of the past and the possibilities of the future. The wind that blows across the Louisiana wetlands today carries the secrets of the past. It whispers through the tall grass, reminding us of the footsteps that once pressed into this earth. If we listen closely, we can hear the cadence of the march, the rhythm of the drums, and the voices that were once raised in defiance. These are not merely sounds of the past, they are the vibrations of a legacy that refuses to be forgotten. By participating in this dialogue, you are ensuring that these vibrations continue to reach the ears of future generations. You are becoming a carrier of the truth, a witness to the humanity of those who were denied it for so long. As we conclude this chapter of our investigation, let us carry the image of Charles Deslondes and his comrades not as victims, but as heroes of a forgotten liberation movement. Let us see the German coast not as a place of death, but as a site of profound revolutionary significance. Let us hold these truths in our hearts and minds, letting them inform our understanding of the world around us. The fight for truth is, at its core, the fight for our shared humanity. It is the effort to recognize the value in every life and the necessity of every story. Thank you for joining us in this mission of reclamation. The journey continues, the ink remains fresh, and the history is still waiting to be written by those who have the courage to remember. Never let the complexity of the past deter you from seeking the core of the human experience. It is found in the moments where injustice meets resolve, where the silence is broken by the demand for recognition, and where the echoes of the ancestors become the call to action for the living. The path is often winding, and the obstacles are many, but the destination is a more honest and equitable future. Stay committed, stay engaged, and carry the memories of the German coast with you as you navigate the complexities of your own time. Always remember that you are part of an ongoing process, a participant in the living history that connects us all. The story of 1811 is one of many, and your attention to it is a powerful act of justice. Let us remain steadfast in our curiosity, for in the search for the truth, we find the best of ourselves. The ink has not dried on this history. It is waiting for your hand to turn the next page. Yet, to truly grasp the magnitude of the 1811 uprising, we must move beyond the singular focus on the act of rebellion itself and turn our eyes toward the geography of the spirit that defined the German coast. This land, a ribbon of fertile soil carved out by the Mississippi River, was a landscape of extreme contradictions. It was here that the architectural manifestations of wealth, the grand plantation houses with their sweeping galleries and manicured gardens, sat in direct, violent tension with the cramped, stifling quarters where the enslaved population sought to preserve their sense of self. To walk this ground today, even as the river continues its relentless push against the levees, is to engage in a sensory confrontation with the past. You can almost feel the humidity of that January night, the damp, gripping cold that did little to chill the fever of anticipation that had been building for months, perhaps years, in the quiet corners of the sugar mills. The logistical genius of Charles Deslondes and his contemporaries is often overlooked in the rush to categorize their actions as merely emotional or reactionary. They operated with a level of strategic foresight that belied the conditions under which they lived. They communicated across vast distances, navigating a surveillance state that sought to keep them isolated and atomized. They utilized the very tools of their oppression, the roads, the waterways, the rhythms of the harvest, to organize a movement that spanned miles. This was not a chaotic riot, it was a disciplined assertion of sovereignty. When we examine the coordinated movements of the men who marched toward New Orleans, we see the blueprint of a military campaign. They understood that the power of the plantation economy rested on the illusion of stability and total control. By shattering that illusion, even for a brief window of time, they forced the colonial powers to reveal their own fragility and their reliance on sheer, brutal force to maintain the status quo. Consider the role of the landscape itself as a silent participant in this history. The swamps functioned as both a refuge and a barrier, a place where the runaway could find a temporary sanctuary, a place where the knowledge of the terrain became an asymmetric weapon against the heavily armed militias. The marshlands of Louisiana were not empty spaces, they were complex, living ecosystems that the enslaved knew intimately. This mastery of the environment, this ability to thrive where others saw only danger, is a testament to the resilience of those who were consistently dehumanized. When Deslondes gathered his forces, he was not just assembling men, he was assembling a collective knowledge of the land, a shared understanding of how to maneuver through the shadows of the cypress trees and the labyrinthine bayous. This connection to the land is a vital piece of the puzzle, reinforcing the idea that their resistance was rooted in a profound desire to reclaim the very soil they had been forced to cultivate for others. As we peel back the layers of the archival record, we encounter the voices of those who were tasked with suppressing the uprising. The colonial administrators, the terrified plantation owners, the militia commanders. Their accounts are steeped in fear and the desperate need to restore a sense of order that they knew was fundamentally illegitimate. They wrote of the uprising as an incomprehensible act of madness, an aberration that threatened to tear the fabric of their civilization apart. But what they were actually documenting was the birth of a new political consciousness. They were witnessing the moment when the mask of the submissive laborer was discarded, revealing the face of the revolutionary. In their frantic letters and reports, they inadvertently confirmed the potency of the challenge that Deslondes and his comrades had mounted. They recognized, perhaps more clearly than they cared to admit, that this was not a localized dispute, but a systemic threat to the entire institution of slavery. The aftermath of 1811 was marked by a campaign of terror designed to erase the memory of what had transpired. Public executions, the display of severed heads on poles along the road to New Orleans, the systematic destruction of the history of the rebellion in the local newspapers, these were all efforts to reinstall the silence. They wanted to ensure that no one would dare to repeat the words or the actions of the rebels. Yet history has a way of leaking through the cracks of even the most fortified silence. The stories were passed down in hushed tones, hidden in the lyrics of field songs, tucked away in the oral traditions of families who carried the memory of their ancestors through the generations. The work of reclamation that we are engaged in now is a continuation of that quiet, persistent resistance. We are, in effect, completing the project that the authorities of 1811 tried to extinguish. We are filling in the blanks they created, restoring the names they sought to strike from the record, and giving life back to the stories they tried to bury. It is essential to understand that this history is not trapped in a static box of the 19th century. It has a direct, pulsating connection to the issues of our own time. When we discuss the systemic inequalities that persist today, we are effectively discussing the echoes of the systems that were challenged in 1811. The structures of power that required such extreme measures to maintain themselves in the early 19th century have evolved, morphed, and adapted, but their core remains the same. By studying the German Coast Uprising, we are learning about the endurance of power. But more importantly, we are learning about the endurance of the human spirit. We are seeing how individuals, faced with the most daunting odds, found the courage to say no, to demand their due, and to act in defense of their own humanity. This is a lesson that transcends the specific circumstances of the past and serves as a beacon for anyone who is committed to the cause of justice today. Imagine, if you will, the courage it took to stand up in that moment. There was no guarantee of success, no promise of a better future waiting just over the horizon. There was only the immediate, visceral knowledge that the current situation was untenable. To take that first step, to raise a weapon, to march forward into the unknown, that is the essence of true bravery. It is a quality that we often romanticize in fictional heroes, but we fail to honor in the people who actually lived it. Deslondes and his peers were not looking for a place in a history book. They were looking for their lives. They were seeking to define themselves on their own terms, to break the chains that bound them, not just physically, but psychologically and socially. Their struggle was an act of existential necessity, a declaration that they were not merely objects to be managed, but subjects who possessed the agency to shape their own destiny. To engage with this history is to undergo a transformation of one's own perspective. You begin to notice the silences in the narratives that surround us, the omissions that serve to maintain the comfort of the status quo. You start to question the version of history that is presented in textbooks and monuments, searching instead for the voices that were muted or excluded. You develop a more sensitive ear for the echoes of the past that resonate in the present. This is the work of a critical thinker, an engaged citizen, and a conscious human being. It is not an easy process. It requires the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths and the patience to sift through the fragments of the past. But it is an incredibly rewarding endeavor, one that deepens our empathy and strengthens our resolve to build a more just and equitable world. As we move deeper into this investigation, consider the importance of storytelling as a tool for justice. The victors of history have always understood that the person who controls the narrative controls the future. By reclaiming the history of the German coast, we are taking back a piece of our future. We are asserting that our collective memory is not something that can be sculpted by those in power, but something that must be nurtured and protected by the community itself. Every time we share this story, every time we question the official record, every time we highlight the significance of the 1811 event, we are participating in a fundamental shift in the way history is understood. We are moving away from a hierarchical, top-down approach and toward a more democratic, inclusive understanding of our shared past. Let us also consider the broader impact of this narrative on the way we perceive leadership and activism. In our modern context, we often look for leaders who fit a certain mold, who operate within established frameworks of influence. But the 1811 uprising reminds us that the most profound shifts in human history often come from the margins, from those who possess nothing but their own resolve and the power of their collective action. Deslondes did not have the resources of a state, the backing of a wealthy institution, or the support of the ruling class. He had the trust and the solidarity of his fellow enslaved workers. That is a form of power that is often underestimated, but it is in reality the most potent force for change in any society. It is the power that arises when people decide that they are no longer willing to accept their marginalization. As you reflect on the legacy of the German coast, think about the spaces in your own life where you have the opportunity to make a difference. Where are the silences that need to be broken? Where are the truths that need to be reclaimed? The story of 1811 is a call to action that extends far beyond the borders of Louisiana. It is a universal reminder of the power of the human spirit to overcome oppression and to strive for a life of dignity and freedom. Every effort you make to understand this history, every conversation you have, every connection you make between the past and the present is a step toward a more honest and equitable future. Do not underestimate the value of this work. It is the essential labor of building a society that recognizes the humanity of all its members, a society that is not defined by the shadows of the past, but by the light of its own aspirations. The river continues to flow, a constant reminder of the passage of time and the persistence of the landscape. The German coast remains, its soil still holding the secrets of those who worked it, fought for it, and died for it. We are the inheritors of this land and this story. We have the responsibility to ensure that these memories are not lost, that these voices are not muffled, and that these lives are not forgotten. The path forward is not always clear, and the challenges are often daunting, but we are not alone. We are joined by the thousands of voices that have come before us, the echoes of the ancestors who dared to dream of a different world. Let their courage be our inspiration, let their resilience be our foundation, and let their story be the guide that leads us toward a future where the promise of justice is finally, truly realized. In the final analysis, our study of the 1811 uprising is not just about looking backward. It is about equipping ourselves with the wisdom and the perspective needed to navigate the challenges of our own time. We live in an era that is also defined by profound tensions, by a struggle to reconcile our past with our aspirations for the future. The same impulses that drove the rebellion of 1811, the desire for autonomy, the demand for recognition, the refusal to be dehumanized, are still at work in our world today. By honoring the participants of the German Coast Rebellion, we are honoring the very essence of what it means to be a human being, fighting for the right to exist on one's own terms. So let us carry this torch forward. Let us keep the dialogue open. Let us keep the ink fresh. And let us keep the memory of Charles Deslondes and his comrades alive in our hearts and minds. They fought for a future they would not live to see, and it is our privilege and our duty to help build that future for them, for ourselves, and for all those who will follow in our footsteps.